Hello and welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig Show.
Welcome to one of the internet's best podcasts, where we dive deep into the lives of the extraordinary and fascinating people who leave an indelible mark on our world. Join us as we explore their captivating stories, remarkable achievements, and unique perspectives that shape history and inspire generations. Get ready to embark on a journey through the lives of inspiring people unlike any other.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the show. My name is Avrum Rosensweig, and indeed, this is called the Avrum Rosensweig Show. Makes a lot of sense. The idea behind the show is to honor humankind. It's to give ourselves a pat on the back, to recognize the beauty that exists in our world, despite that cloud that seems to be hovering over us so often. And how I like to do that, how I like to pat humankind on the back, is by interviewing individuals who are highly inspirational, people who have stories to tell, people who have great success, and even more than that, individuals who have found their zone in life, that thing which helps them move forward and to embrace their existence. So what I always ask my listeners and my viewers to do is throughout the show, just be conscious of how my guest has found their stride and has developed it into something really, really special. We're very excited today to have with us, my guest today is Dwayne Epstein. Dwayne, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good. Thanks, Avrum. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Now,
Cool.
I know that it's not Epstein, it's Epstein, although you used to mess with your teachers' heads, right?
How did you know that?
I just picked that up somewhere.
When I was in school, real quick, the first day of school, they call my name and they would say Epstein, and I would say Steen here, and then the next day they would say Epstein, and I would go Stein here. I would go on for about a week or two the first year in school.
Do you still do that, by the way? Do you still bug people?
If it's available to do so, sure.
Yeah, me too. So do I.
My
Now,
father was a real stickler about it, being as I said earlier, very, very Jewish. He would always tell people, and me, he said, don't ever let anybody call you Epstein. That's German. We're Epstein. We're Jewish.
yeah, right. Ladies and gentlemen, Dwayne Epstein is the author of New York Times bestseller biography, Lee Marvin, Point Blank, which was also a finalist in the Forward magazine Book of the Year competition. There it is. Thank you. He's the author of the current Amazon bestseller, Killin Generals, The Making of the Dirty Dozen, the most iconic World War II film of all time, which there we go too. Thank you very much. You're very good at that, you know. Published on April 25th, 2023 by Citadel Press. Prior to writing biographies, Epstein contributed to Film Chronicles on a regular basis. He wrote for Film Facts magazine on subjects such as Bobby Darin, The Rat Pack, television producer Stephen Allen, filmmaker Sam Fuller, comic book artist Neil Adams, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and John Belushi, and the list goes. Oh, and Sid Caesar. List goes on. Epstein later contributed to Cahir's Du Cinéma, Serious Pleasures, which had a high profile in Europe. He wrote on American films chosen for rediscovery by directors Oliver Stone, Francis Ford Coppola, Woody Allen, and Clint Eastwood. He is also the winner of the Bronze in Biography of 2013 Independent Publisher Book Award, Indie Book of the Year finalist, and New York Times bestseller at number 4 in June 2014. And I think most importantly, he was on the Thespian Honor Society list at Whitney High School, right?
Well, actually, I went to Whitney and Cerritos High, and it was at Cerritos High that I was in the Thespian Honor Society.
Yeah, I love that. How was high school, by the way?
It was okay. I don't want to get off track, but it was interesting in that I went to Cerritos Elementary. I went to Cerritos Junior High. I went to Cerritos High School. I spent a couple of semesters at Cerritos College. It was like I was going to die in Cerritos. Yeah. Likely die. But it was fun. I enjoyed being, a theater major. And then in my sophomore year, they opened another school Whitney. It was originally called Whitney Community Learning Center, and I applied and was accepted, and I spent my junior and senior year there.
Yeah, and you mentioned in an interview that you did that you weren't much of a student, but that when an essay would be given by a teacher for you to write, that you dove right into it. You loved the process of writing.
You really did your homework, boy.
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit.
The way it worked, I always tell people, you know how they always say things like inspiration often comes like a light bulb over your head, but in reality, it's more like a whack in the back of your head with a 2x4. Because it took me a long time to realize I had any writing skill. I spent a good part of my teen and adult years doing menial labor, like, you know, being a server in a restaurant and working in warehouses, what have you. It never really dawned on me that I could put a sentence together and make sense of it. And sometimes do some, I would, how can I put this? I would write periodically, professionally, off and on. But as you mentioned, as part of my resume, when I wrote for Film Facts, I eventually worked for a company called Miller Educational Materials, where I would also do some writing for the company, as well as being, excuse me, the chief editor for the company. And eventually, here's the thing. I'm going to backtrack a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
When I've got two older sisters, and when I was a little boy, when I was a baby, if my mother is accurate about this, she used to tell people that when it was a hot summer night or we just wanted to get out of the house, load us all into a station wagon and go to a drive-in. Now my mother swears that when I was a baby, before I could even walk or talk, while my older sisters were asleep in the back seat, even after the end credits, I was wide awake the entire time watching the flickering light on the drive-in screen. So my love of movies goes back that far. And it took me a long, long time to realize I could do both. I could love movies and I can write about movies. And in terms of inspiration or you know, doing what you love, it's certainly that.
You know, it's interesting that scenario that you bring up. I remember when I was a kid as well, and you and I were both born in 1960, so we're contemporaries.
Yes, we are.
I remember my parents taking me to a drive-in, and it was in the heat of the night.
Perfect.
I saw that. Perfect.
I saw that in the theaters too, but it was a regular movie theater.
You know, and I can remember being there. I remember the discussion I had with my parents afterwards, and I can even remember as a youngster being fascinated by the theme, by the context. Even though I'm sure I had a bit of a time understanding the whole idea behind the movie, but it with me as well. Now, this begs the next question, which is, you know, you've spoken about the 60s and 70s films. And you said that those you believe in your heart are the best films, at least for you.
Right.
And then around the 80s, they start to drop off in quality. What did you mean by that?
Okay, it's real simple. Well, first of all, I'm a film fan of every decade of American filmmaking, every decade. But the 60s and 70s were especially beloved by me for several reasons. First of all, it was the end of the studio system. There was no more contract players, and that meant or writers or directors, which meant they were able to finally do what they wanted to do, not what the studio bosses told them to do. And I know a lot of periodicals at the time bemoaned the end of the studio system, that everybody going freelance, it's ruining the film industry, blah, 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 blah. The result is, though, some of the best films ever made. And also, not just the end of the studio system, but also the end of the production code, which is, you know, when they brought in, I think it was in 67 or 68, when it was, you know, G, PG, M, mature, R, X, all of that, which, once again, to some wags, for lack of a better way to to call them, they said it would ruin the industry because people wouldn't want to go see an R-rated movie, certainly not an X-rated movie, but, you know, it may have created certain clicks within the audience itself overwhelmingly, but it didn't kill the industry, not at all. It meant they could deal with subjects now that they weren't able to deal with before, and do it in ways that they hadn't dealt before. Now, granted, when something like that comes about, the first thing that's going to happen is movies are going to have more sexual content. Movies are going to have more violence in them and so-called obscene language more than ever before. And it might be very gratuitous, but in a very short period of time, that went to the wayside, but not entirely, because they still make movies like that. But for the most part, especially the good films, even in some cases, honestly, great films, that was never a fact. I mean, that never kept films from being great. In some instances, such as the films of what I consider to be a pivotal year in movies, 1967, were some of the best films ever made. And they were like watershed films. Like you mentioned a moment ago, In the Heat of the Night was one of them. Also, Cool Hand Luke, Bonnie and Clyde, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And of all those films that came out that year, this was the #1 film at the box office. Made more money than any other film. And
why do you think that was?
Well, it's interesting because I think there was a number of reasons, and one of them being for I would think the overused phrase, it was a perfect storm, in that at the time the film came out, the Vietnam War was just starting to escalate, and Johnson was sending more troops, and consequently those those younger people who were younger audience members who were available for the draft, they saw the film, and they saw it a lot, as being anti-war, or at the very least anti-military. And for the older generations, World War II had ended just 15 years prior, and many of the audience had been in the war, and they saw it as kind of, pro-war, and it's, let's go kill us a bunch of Nazis. This is fun. And more importantly, the performances and the direction by Robert Aldridge were some of the best ever. It's one of the best all-male ensemble casts. There's only one woman in the whole film. Excuse me. Oh, well, there's actually a couple, but one that has a larger scene. Excuse me. And it was just an incredible cast. Some of the actors in the film were riding high at the time, like Lee Marvin. It was his high water mark. That same year, by the way, he was voted the single most popular male star in America. So that worked well for him. He also did the movie Point Blank the same year, which is kind of a cult classic. Also, you had John Cassavetes, Jim Brown, Ernest Borgnine, Charles Bronson, Clint Walker, Donald Sutherland, just an amazing cast of actors. And they worked. They worked really well.
You actually interviewed some of the survivors from that for your book. Excuse me. Donald Sutherland but he is one of the individuals whom you did interview. What was that interview like? What sort of man is he?
He's a very, very proud Canadian, which I'm sure you're.
We do know that.
He's I think I don't remember where or how, but at some point, maybe a few years ago, he was voted into Canada's Hall of Fame or greatest living people or something like that. I don't know what it was, but he was very proud of that. And what's interesting is, because he was Canadian, the interview I did was mostly via email. I'd ask him questions, he'd answer them and send them back. And we did that like 2 or 3 times. And a lot of his answers were in French. He would say, he would, I forgot the phrase he used, but something in response to a question, and you'll have to correct me because I don't know French, but he referred to it as like a croque de merde or something like that, meaning it was a crock of shit, basically.
Right. That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, but his answers were great. He gave me some. One of the things, because I had read the book and detailed it and seen the movie countless times, I was able to ask him his character of Vernon Pinkley. I asked him. I said, in the book as well as in the film, he's one of the few characters, the convict Vernon Pinkley, it's never said what he did wrong. Yeah. What was he convicted for? Because he wasn't given a life sentence. He was given like 20 years hard labor, 30 years hard labor, something like that. And Donald Sutherland told me, he said, "You're right. It's never said." So I decided in my mind, he got convicted for stealing food, and they wanted to make an exception of him. The authorities decided you're not going to do that again, and we're going to make sure you won't, blah, blah, that kind of thing. And he said, I had it all mapped out in my head, how this guy thinks, how this guy acts and reacts. And he goes, I had a movie screen inside my eyelids, and I always knew exactly how Pinkley was going to react in some scene. And consequently, by the way, he was one of the last people hired, and his role in the movie was actually much smaller than what it became. He kept getting, scenes added. When they were rehearsed, they rehearsed for like 4 weeks, which is very unusual for a motion picture. And they all, they did the rehearsal. It was filmed in England, and they rented a soundstage, and they had this great big long table that they all sat around with scripts, and they would go through it. Each character doing their thing. And probably the most famous scene he has in the movie is when he gets chosen by Lee Marvin's character, Colonel Reisman, to inspect the troops. Yes. Now, almost all of that was ad-libbed by Donald Sutherland. And the funny thing is...
Was it really? Wow.
Yeah. He wasn't really supposed to do it. It was supposed to be Clint Walker. But Clint Walker didn't want to do it. He plays a Native American, Samson Posey. And when he was asked to do it, Clint Walker said, I don't really think this is complimentary to Native Americans, sir. And so Aldridge just looked around the table. And Donald Sutherland told me this. He goes, he looked around the table. He saw me and went, you with the big ears, you do it. That's how he got the part. There wasn't, he always was going to direct it. I got to interview the producer, Ken Hyman, who's still very much alive. He's in his 90s. He lives in England. Talked to him over the phone. And he's the kind of guy that once I found out how to find him, and by the way, it was not easy. He's been off the grid for a long, long time.
It was through his wife, who's a photographer, right?
Long retired. And I'm sorry?
You found him through his wife, who was a photographer, right?
Oh, right. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. When I did find him, I like to tell people, not to brag, but how come there's no Jewish detectives?
You were saying, yeah, right.
No famous Jewish detectives. Anyway, once I found him, I said, it's nice to meet you, Mr. Hyman. And he went, please call me Ken. And I said, yes, I will, Mr. Hyman. And he said, call me Mr. Hyman one more time, and I'm hanging up this phone. And that's the kind of guy he is. Yeah, he was really, really cool. He told me great stuff, too. And he told me that he always wanted Robert Aldridge to be the director. But if Aldridge wasn't available, he said his backup choice would have been Sam Peckinpah, who would have been interesting as well, except that Sam Peckinpah was known as a real pain in the ass when it came to directing. He directed some great movies, some stinkers too, but sometimes that phrase, rather self-destructive, that was Peckinpah. Yes. But couldn't say that about Robert Aldridge. He was one tough. I don't know if I can use the word on your podcast.
You can.
He was one tough motherfucker. No two ways about it. And
go ahead.
Yeah. No, you go ahead.
It's interesting that you said that in terms of being able to secure interviews for your book, that pretty much everyone who was around said yes. I believe Robert Aldridge's daughter said no, but she was in mourning at the time, right?
Absolutely. How did you know that?
I just did my research. I wanted to impress you.
I did, and you are. I didn't know I had said that anywhere, but yeah, her husband had just passed away, so she wasn't, able to talk, and I can respect that. Same thing with Jim Brown. I tried to interview Jim Brown because there's a lot of fascinating things about that man, and he never responded, and now I know why, because he passed away just before the book came out, so he wasn't doing well.
Dwayne, what's it like for you to interview these big stars or even children of stars? Are you starstruck at all?
On occasion, yeah, to a certain extent. Well, here's the thing. I don't want to make it sound anything negative, but I've just been doing this for a very long time. And there have been occasions where I've definitely been starstruck with some of the work I've done in the past. I was very starstruck to interview Sid Caesar for Film Facts. I idolized the guy, even though most of what he was known for was done before I was born, because he was huge in the 50s with the TV show he had. I was extremely familiar with it. I'd watch anytime There was a rerun of anything he ever did, that kind of thing. And his writing staff was incredible. The best writing staff in the history of television.
Oh, you think so?
Are you kidding?
Yeah.
Mel Brooks,
no. I love
Carl Reiner, Woody Allen, Neil Simon, Larry Gelbart.
Okay.
I mean, these guys were incredible. I told him, your writing staff was the Mount Olympus of comedy.
Yeah.
I mean, they were incredible. And what was really cool is, and I used this in the intro to my piece, was that one of the greatest joys in life would be to sit down and have a one-on-one with Sid Caesar for the whole day. And he tells stories and anecdotes. He gets happy. He gets angry. He does accents. And his memory was amazing. I remember asking him at one point about putting a level of his Jewishness into his humor. And I said, you did a bit that was a take up on Shane, where you were Shane and you were coming in off the prairie, and Carl Reiner is the Alan Ladd character, and Sid Caesar says, "Howdy, stranger. Might you have some water? I'm mighty parched." And Carl Reiner says, "It's dry on the plains, isn't it?" And Sid Caesar goes, "No, I had a herring for lunch and it's laying here like a rock." So, and when I said that, Sid Caesar went, "No, it was breakfast." His memory was amazing.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I'll tell you a real quick. I'm sorry.
No, you keep going. I'm loving your stories.
Real quick anecdote about the day I interviewed him. First of all, I was starstruck and I was very nervous, and it was at his house in I think it was Brentwood. And while I'm waiting to be spoken to or introduced, I'm waiting in the living room or the hallway, whatever. And he was doing a series of interviews to promote his TV show being put on VHS. And the guy doing the interview before me was with NPR. And I know I shouldn't say it, but I think it deserves being said, because Sid Caesar just lit into him. I don't know if you know this or not, but Sid Caesar had a very famous temper, really bad temper. Yeah. And he was screaming at this guy and he was saying, "Get the hell out of my house, you son of a bitch. You don't even know what you're doing here." Right. And the producer of the videotapes had to escort him out. And then the producer, his name was Rick something. I don't remember his last name. Anyway, the producer goes, "Okay, Mr. Epstein, you're next." And I was like, "Oh, shit. I got to follow that. Oh, my God." And I said, "Is he okay to talk to me?" And he went, "Oh, yeah, he's fine. The thing is," he goes, "the problem with that NPR guy was that he didn't do his homework. He didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know anything about Sid, his career, the people he's worked with. And when you come unprepared, Sid is going to light into you like nothing else." Well, luckily, I did my homework. And so consequently, we had a great time. I had a great time.
Yeah, that's lovely. And did you ever speak to him again after that?
Well, no, I didn't, but he did send me, which I have framed, and it's on my wall somewhere. I can't find it. He sent me a letter thanking me for the interview, saying he had a lot of fun. Yeah, which was really nice.
Do you look for those accolades at all? Like when you're finished doing an interview, be it through email or face to face, are you curious as to how they felt about it?
Sure, I'm human like anybody else. I don't necessarily look for accolades, but I'd like to know that what I've accomplished was appreciated. That's all.
And when you go to a Sid Caesar, is there something that you have in mind that you would like to bring him?
Well, here's the thing. Before I did the interview, my best friend and I, one of the guys I mentioned to you before, Brett.
Mike.
Yeah, but not Mike. This time it was Brett. He's the one who sent me Davis because he's so short. Anyway, yeah, we're still friends.
That's, by the way, it's an in-joke at this point. We'll have to touch on it later. Yeah.
Okay. He's a big fan of comedy. He's a cartoonist for a living. He does Garfield with Jim Davis, and he has his own strip called Diamond Lil, which is hilarious. Anyway, because he's so into comedy and like me has been his whole life, I asked him, "What would you ask Sid Caesar?" Because I'm drawing a blank here. I don't know. And he thought for a moment and he said, "I would ask Sid Caesar, of that great writing staff, who was good at what? Who did what best?" That's what I would ask. And I went, "Brett, that's a great question."
Yeah.
And I got to ask him that, and his answer was wonderful. He said, well, first of all, what I love is he explained to me how the writing staff worked, in that they were in this big room, and he says, nobody wrote anything, okay? It was very much like the way they showed on the Dick Van Dyke Show, that, Buddy, Sally, and Rob never really wrote. They just threw ideas back and forth. Well, Sid Caesar said it worked like that, in that he was at this table, this long conference table, and he sat on a throne. Larry Gelbart bought him a throne, and he sat on this throne, and the ideas would be going back and forth, and Sid would sit there on his throne very proudly, and he would hear everything. And when everybody's shouting back and forth, Sid would go, I like that. Use that. Or that one's good. And more also, inversely, he would say, and if something was bad, oh, you bet I let him know it. And he would go like this. This is the way he would say something didn't work. He would go, he was very dramatic in the way he did this stuff. And I love
he would kill his writers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, or their jokes, actually. He apparently said, when you want his answer to the question, that's when I told him that comedy writing staff was the Mount Olympus of comedy. He said, thank you. It was pretty good. And he goes, and his answer was, if you want something stupid and crazy, you go to Mel Brooks. If you want something intelligent and something that actually gives you a second to think about, you go to Larry Gelbart. If you want, excuse me, you go to Woody Allen. And if you want something that's a great play on words, you go to Larry Gelbart. And the only one who actually did any writing was Lucille Callan, who was a writer on the show. And I remember hearing Neil Simon say in an interview, he said, after we do a writing session, and then like a couple of days later, the show would air and it went out live. He said, I'd be watching the show with my wife, and she would look at me and go, who came up with that line? And Neil Simon would say, I have no idea. I have no idea how the show got written. It's like, that's how genius comes about. It's a great show.
The image that I have in my head as you tell these stories, they're fabulous stories. Is what absolutely. These are treasure troves. They're wonderful. Is that these guys, these women, they must have been having an amazing time together, right?
Oh, you bet.
Right.
And once again, I remember seeing on a roundtable show of all the writers reunited, and they were asked, would you do this again if given the opportunity? And Sid Caesar was the first one to answer. He goes, no. It's a young man's game. You can't be our age and do this kind of thing week after week after week. It's impossible. And then the moderator asked, how, at the time, he was very popular, how would you do a parody of a Quentin Tarantino movie? And Sid Caesar said, easy, play it straight. I love that.
That's a good one. I guess for you, it's a little bit different because you go out and you do your homework, you do your interviews, and then you have to sit in your room and you have to type, right?
Right.
So the camaraderie is between you and the words.
Sure. Well, I'd like to think on occasion there's a level of camaraderie with the interview subject. I mean, I never, you're not supposed to become great friends or anything. That's kind of against journalism rules, I guess. And on occasion, I have gotten subjects very mad at me. Most prominently, Shelley Berman. I interviewed him. Remember Shelley Berman?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Yeah. Well, he got really mad at me.
Well, what happened?
This is funny. I was really concerned about whether I can even use this or not. But when I told it to my publisher at FilmFacts, Mike Stein, he laughed and went, "Oh, this is great. Yeah, use it, definitely." I had asked him about Lenny Bruce, who was a contemporary of his. And I framed it in the sense that there was like a trinity of 1960s, mid to early 1960s, comedy god, stand-up god. Lenny Bruce, Mort Saul, and Shelley Berman. And I asked him about Lenny Bruce. And at first he would say things like, I would say on stage, the Pope is completely indifferent to Lenny Bruce, which I thought was cute. And then I asked him, he said that sometimes Lenny would go overboard in what he would say to the audience. Like, he used the example about a bunch of college kids, high school kids, had gone to see one of his shows. And when he saw them in the audience, this is Shelley Berman telling the story. When he saw them in the audience, Lenny Bruce went, "So, are you guys going to go fuck after the prom?" And Shelley Berman said he thought that was highly wrong, inappropriate, and what have you. And I asked him, did anybody really wonder what a bunch of high school kids are doing in a nightclub? And he went, "Turn that tape off. The interview was over. We're not going any further with this." And I went, wait a minute, come on. Okay, if you want, I can take that out, but I don't think it's that big a deal. And he eventually acquiesced, and we finished the interview. But like I said, when I told Mike Stein, he went, "Oh, that's great. I love that story. It's going in."
It is a good story. By the way, a great joke. Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce was completely inappropriate. He was on
That's
stage.
the idea.
That's the idea. Exactly. You're right. Exactly. And he was on stage once, and someone in the audience yelled up, he goes, "You fucking Jew, you killed Jesus Christ." And Lenny Bruce goes, "Yeah, you know what? I did kill Jesus Christ, and if he comes back, I'm going to kill him again."
Right on. He did a great bit about Jesus. That's one of my favorites. That whole thing about how, well, you're Jewish, right? How would you define Jew? Well, a Jew is one who descends from the 12 tribes of Israel. And most non-Jews would go, "Oh, no, you're not. We know what a Jew is. One who killed our Lord."
Yeah.
And he goes, "How long are you going to keep busting our chops over that? I mean, come on." And then he said, "All right, I admit it. We did it. We did him up and we did him in. And you know why? Because he didn't want to become a doctor." I mean, he was hysterical about stuff like that. And
he was.
The fact that he was inappropriate on purpose and was always pushing the envelope beyond where it should go. I would say, other than George Carlin, he's my all-time favorite comedian. I loved Lenny Bruce.
I also did. I loved Lenny Bruce. His ending wasn't so good, though, was it?
No, God, it was awful.
Yeah.
He was basically hounded to death. They took away his cabaret card. They fined him up the wazoo, so he was broke. It was really, really sad. All for the bad, for the evil thing of saying things nobody else had ever said before.
Right.
That's how I see it.
I mean, that's how I see it too. I think sane people do, but his career was unbelievable, and I think he really did a lot for future generations, allowing comedians to go where they may not have. Today we have a bit of a problem because of the woke culture, and comedians are a little bit more scared, I think.
Yeah, I know. I remember hearing Mel Brooks say in an interview that political correctness is the worst thing that ever happened to comedy. And to a certain extent, I agree with him. To a certain extent. I also, by the way, one of my other favorite interviews was Steve Allen, who was just remarkable. There wasn't anything he didn't know something about, and oftentimes a lot. And just that's what made me think of him was when we just now talking about Lenny Bruce. He was the first person to put Lenny Bruce on television. He was the first person to put Elvis Presley on television. He had Jack Kerouac doing readings. He had Jerry Lee Lewis. I mean, as I referred to the article, the interview, I called him the hip spy in the House of Square, because that's what he is. And he said, the reason why I was able to get away with putting these nonconformist mavericks on television was because I looked like, he said, I knew what I looked like. I looked like a Sunday school teacher in a girls' Midwestern college. so people accept it on that level.
That's good. It's
great
very
stories about all of them.
You must be so honored to have had that opportunity. What a wonderful chance to meet.
Absolutely.
Like, I think you mentioned in one of your interviews that you love creative sorts, and somebody somebody asked you, Dwayne, what kind of Jewish name is Dwayne, by the way? Where's that from?
Oh God. Oh man. I could tell you stories. One of my favorite interviews I did when I was working on the Lee Marvin book, I got to interview Dwayne Hickman. And I told him, especially the way it was spelled, I told him, you've always been a hero of mine because we share the same first name. And he asked me, my parents are from the South. Were your parents from the South? And I said, yeah, South Brooklyn. My mother just loved names that were out of the ordinary. I've got two sisters, Fern and Belinda, which are both not that common amongst Jewish families. But that's how she wanted it.
I never understood Dwayne because it seems like it's Wayne with a D attached in the beginning. I didn't get it.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I had a friend in high school. My best friend in high school was named Tyrone Elliott. In junior high, he was 6 feet tall and skinny as a rail. As I like to tell people, he couldn't keep the seat down in a movie theater. And it was Dwayne and Tyrone. And when we enter a room and we introduce ourselves, people expected a couple of Motown backup singers, you know? But we were two really white guys.
So actually, let's stay on this this mode of thinking. You were telling me before about your buddies. I mean, I am fascinated about your books. Don't get me wrong, but I love people's background. So you were telling me about your buddies, and I really related to this group of friends that you have because I have the same group that we've been hanging around together with for years and years and years. One of them, my buddy Moish, is I cannot be as
that's my father's name.
Moish, yeah, Morris Moish, exactly. I cannot be as uncouth with anybody as I can with Moish. You know, I cherish that. Tell me about your buddies, your Rat Pack.
Okay, well, we all met in the summer of 1978. I had just gotten out of high school, and I got a summer job at Movieland Wax Museum, which no longer exists, hasn't existed for a while, in Buena Park, Orange County, California. And to me, because I'm such a movie fan anyway, it was a dream job. I loved it. And the four of us got really tight that summer. And we were all either 17 or 18, and we are still friends. And the names were Brett, Greg, and Mike. And we made ourselves the Movieland Rat Pack. And we gave ourselves different delineations. My buddy Mike was Dean Martin because he was cool. Greg was Peter Lawford because he dressed so well.
Yeah.
Brett was Sammy Davis Jr. because he was so tiny, still is. And I was Frank Sinatra. I was voted Sinatra because they considered me the linchpin. I'm the guy who brought it all together. And of course, we used to do that old joke too. Last one in the room is Cesar Romero. I don't know where this stuff comes from, but it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
So you decided, go ahead.
No, that's all right.
You decided that when you wrote your book, I've always wondered about how people dedicate their book, but in the front of Killin Generals, there's a beautiful, actually, dedication.
Thank you.
And it says, from Mike, he knows why, and to Barbara, she knows why. So let us into as to why.
Sure. Well, Barbara, she knows why because she's my girlfriend and I love her.
And you love her.
And I know she heard me because she's right. Oh, there she is. Right behind
Hello,
me.
Barbara.
Hello, Barbara. Anyway, and to Mike, he didn't know. he didn't know I was going to dedicate it to him, but I saw it as, I kind of had to, because when we were younger, first of all, I can't begin to tell you how many times I saw The Dirty Dozen. Because of our age, I remember seeing it on TV for the first time, and they would break it up into two parts. It was on the CBS Thursday night movie, the first part, and the second part was on Friday night. And anytime I watched it, I remember exactly when both parts ended. Anyway, or started. And Mike and I used to watch it on TV together. And then when it came out on VHS, I bought it. Okay. And he would, we'd be hanging out. And as you said, maybe just playing a board game, smoking a joint, whatever. And he would always be the one to suggest, hey, you want to watch The Dirty Dozen? Yeah. And okay, fine. And sometimes when he wasn't around and he'd call me, he would go, you want to watch The Dirty Dozen? And it'd always be, of course. And then he did it so often, it got to the point that the phone would ring, I would say hello, and I would hear, and I would go, all right, come on over. And he did that more often than ever. And so for that reason, I had to dedicate it to him.
And how did he feel when he saw it in the book?
Oh, he was blown away. He was shocked. Been. He actually called me up because I had sent him a copy and I hadn't heard from him. And after he read the whole thing, he called me up and he went, I cannot believe you dedicated it to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my landlord, by the way, his name is Mike Peterson. When he saw that, he went, "You didn't have to dedicate the book to me." And I went, "I didn't, Mike."
Or every Mike in the world.
Right.
That's a beautiful. Yeah, you go this time.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say, I'm very close friends with his mother, too. In fact, I don't even call her Verna or Mrs. Barrow. I call her Ma Barrow. and she would contact me and said, "I cannot believe you dedicated the book to Mike. I am so proud of you, and I am so proud of Mike." And I went, "Hey, Ma, it's what he deserved it."
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, he loved it.
Well, when does dedication come to you throughout the process of writing? At any given time, at the end, at the beginning?
It depends on the subject, obviously. For the Lee Marvin bio, it was actually kind of easy. I dedicated it to my mother, who taught me how to love movies, and also to my father, who taught me about love.
Explain that more. How did he teach you about love?
My father was the most loving man you'd ever meet in your life, ever. He was incredible that way. And also, too, because I got Lee Marvin's son, Christopher Marvin, to write the afterword, I included his choice for the dedication, which were his sister, who had recently passed away. I just went blank on her name. Claudine? No, darn it. Wait a minute. I got the book right here. I can just look at the opening page here.
Is that Barbara? That's Barbara there in the background?
Indeed it is.
Is Barbara
Jewish?
Is Barbara Jewish, Dwayne?
Only by injection.
Good injection.
I hate that joke. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, his sister was Claudia, and it's dedicated in loving memory. And this is the paperback, which after the hardcover came out, Christopher died. He had brain cancer, so he's in the dedication as well because he died the next year. So yeah, that's how the dedication was decided.
I have to tell you something. When you and I first started communicating through our friend Marco, he's a Brazilian fellow whom I interviewed on my podcast. I must tell you, he's a lovely human being who's very generous of spirit, and he's constantly right, isn't he? Just a beautiful soul, and he's constantly recommending individuals who could be guests on my show, and some of them actually come on, and we have wonderful discussions. I found with you too, from the moment that I started communicating with you, that you were also very generous of spirit. You were excited to come on the show.
Oh, thank you.
That made me very, very happy. I found that you were very accessible, very open in terms of discussion. So when you say that your father, Morris or Moish, taught you about love, I can see it within you. You seem to be a very loving person.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And if I am, which isn't really up to me to decide, it's up to the people who know me, it would be because of him. He was wonderful that way. He wasn't necessarily the brightest bulb in the marquee, but when it came to emotion or showing affection, that was my father. And I'll tell you something. My mother, when I said I learned about movies from her, that is absolutely true. She was, and I just loved the hell out of her for doing this. She was one of those kind of mothers where if there was a movie on that she liked, and it was like 2:00 in the morning, even on a school night, she'd wake me up and tell me to get up and watch it. Yeah, and I'd always appreciated the fact that she would do that. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I would often go to what's called repertory movie theaters, mostly in Hollywood. And when I was growing up, there was a whole lot of them, and it was wonderful. And they were always showing double features. And matter of fact, the first time I saw The Dirty Dozen in a theater was at, I think it was the New Beverly, which luckily still exists, that one. Quentin Tarantino runs it. And I would come home. It would be like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and my mother was an insomniac anyway. So she'd be up, and she would ask me about the movie and want as many details as I could give her. And she was wonderful that way. One thing I'd like to point out as well is that I am a big movie fan, monster movie fan, but I seem to want to focus mainly on that which was, not that which is. I'm really big on retro pop culture. And mainly because, and I know this is going to get people mad at me or fans or what have you, but so be it. I'm just being honest here. Movies, TV, what have you, they're just not as good as they used to be. They're not exploring themes that they used to at the time that you and I went to the movies. And Barbara and I agree about this too. Growing up, I used to go to the movies all the time. Now I can't remember the last time I went to a movie. And I thought, the way movies were being made in those days, I thought it would be like that forever. I thought there'd always be a great movie to go want to see. You saw it the week it opened or the weekend it opened, and it would always be terrific in various degrees. Not anymore. One of the biggest reasons is because of what you see in movies nowadays. I grew up loving comic books, okay? And especially DC. DC was my favorite, not Marvel. And because of that, I was really disappointed when superhero movies saturated movie theaters. They're everywhere. And I'm bored to death with them. And not just that, but a lot of the movies that you see nowadays, especially the more popular ones, are theme park rides. That's the only way I can describe it. And the so-called indie films aren't really indie at all. They're not. Major studios have created these indie arms for the films they want to, promote that way. But they're not. They're just, like zombie movies or kids trying to figure out their lives. And which, when I was 15, that was fine. But I'm not. And, movies for adults, few and far between. Mature adults, and it's really sad. That's why when I saw this cartoon that I thought was really cool, a comic strip cartoon, where it had like 4 doors, okay? And the first door says, movies my friends recommend. Second door says, movies my family recommend. Third door says, movies I've seen 100 times. Well, the guy reading those doors kicks open that door. Movies I've seen 100 times. That's how I feel about it.
It's interesting. What comes to mind is that I remember watching a Dick Van Dyke show many years later. I think it's still on some network somewhere. And
it is on, and we just watched it last night. It's on MeTV out here.
It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal TV. And Mary Tyler Moore's character was dealing with an issue of a friend of hers appeared to be anti-Semitic. And she called her out.
Wait a minute. Wait. Was this the friend that she would play tennis with?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That was the Mary Tyler Moore show. That wasn't Dick Van Dyke.
Oh, thank you for the correction. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I love that show too. Equally good.
And it was her friend Rhoda, who was Jewish on the show and outside of it. And she said, well, their type, And I thought, way to go, man, for dealing with such an important issue.
And once again, I agree completely. And if you want to go there, I think, especially in terms of sitcoms, TV shows of the early 70s were the golden age of television.
Yeah.
Mary Tyler Moore, Barney Miller, All in the Family, MASH. I mean, just amazing TV. And we were lucky enough to live through it. First run.
We were. Which of those were your favorite?
MASH, hands down.
Why?
Love MASH.
Why?
Oh, for God, so many reasons. First of all, the writing was superior. The first year or two, it was written by Larry Gelbart, Sid Caesar alum. And the acting was incredible. Alan Alda was a hero of mine. I still think he's terrific, even though I know he's up there in years. And they were able, because of the setting of the show, they were able to do this rare thing, to do really hilarious comedy, and then within the same episode, or even like the turn of a moment, do dark drama, because they were dealing in a life and death situation. They were doctors in a medical unit. And for that reason alone, and they utilized it to its highest extent, that's why it was my favorite. I would say the same about Barney Miller, but they were civilians and they were cops. And I remember seeing, I think it was Eddie Egan. You remember Eddie Egan?
Yes.
He was the subject of the French Connection. He played the cop. I remember seeing him on a talk show once where he was asked, of all the TV cop shows that have ever aired, which one do you think is the most realistic? And Eddie Egan said, Barney Miller.
Oh, really? How interesting.
Yeah, he said, the reason being is most cops very rarely throughout their career ever pull their gun, ever.
Yeah.
And mostly what we do is just deal with the strangeness of human behavior. And that's what Barney Miller did, week in, week out, brilliantly.
You talked extensively within your interviews and your writings about what you liked about Lee Marvin. And one of the things that you liked about him was that he had a vision on how violence should be portrayed in movies. He himself had been a soldier, and in fact, he partook in one of the most difficult battles of World War II. Very bloody.
The Battle
right.
of Saipan.
Very bloody. So he understood that up front. He had been an eyewitness to terrible, terrible violence. And you said, I think, quoting him, that he wanted to turn violence into something different in movies, that we should have a disdain for it, that we should be disgusted by it, not that it should be entertaining to us. Is that accurate?
In terms of how he felt about it, yes, it is. The thing is, me personally, I don't necessarily agree that that's possible. I know there are some people who have advocated that that those who get executed or are condemned by the death penalty, that they should be aired on television as a deterrent to violence. Well, the thing is, it doesn't really take into account how that kind of thing desensitizes people. If you do that enough, they're not going to care about whether somebody's getting hurt or how painful something like this is. And he very famously would say in interviews, Lee Marvin, that he thought the opposite. He believed that let's make violence as realistic as possible in TV and movies. If I'm going after somebody, I'm going to shoot them point blank, have them fall, and when they fall, turn them over, shoot them again. I want everybody to know how bad violence is. Now, he also hated cartoon violence, but believe it or not, rather ironically, he said sometimes when you watch a John Wayne movie where the violence is, two guys get in a fight in a bar, one guy gets a little trickle of blood in the corner of his mouth, then they make up and have a beer. He said, I hate that. I don't think that's believable at all. Fact of the matter is, he was in one of those movies. It was Donovan's Reef, which I think is an hysterical comedy. But the movie starts with that kind of fight. And worst of all, his very last theatrical film was Delta Force with Chuck Norris. Yes. And that was hands down the single most, one of. He was involved. It was the most cartoon action film I've ever seen. And it's really sad that he was involved in it. And I remember asking his agent, why do you think Lee Marvin made that movie? It was so bad. And Meyer Mishkin, his career-long agent, said, you tell a Marine he can't do something. That was his answer.
So many of the characters, so many of the actors whom you wrote about and whom you liked, they were tough guys, at least on screen.
Yeah,
Steve
right.
You adored Steve McQueen, right?
Big time, big time.
Yeah.
A little less after he died, and there were some personal revelations about him that were really rather disappointing. But overall, his films, with the possible exception of just one, maybe Le Mans, every single one, because that was just so dull. But
I remember Le Mans, yeah.
Yeah, it was stupid. But even The Blob, I don't care what movie it was, everything he ever did are all my favorite films. He was just so watchable, and the movies were so off the beaten path, no matter what it was. He was just the best to me.
So that's the point that I'm trying to make. Steve McQueen, James Cagney, Burt Lancaster, these are the guys you loved. Now, you didn't necessarily love them because they were such tough guys, but you loved them because they were off the beaten path, as you said.
Partly, yes. That was part of it. But also, I identified with them at an early age, and for specific reasons. I'll give you a real quick story. When I was a kid, I was about 8 years old, and I did something, I don't know what it was, naughty, whatever it was. And my mother decided, instead of beating the hell out of me, she's going to teach me a lesson. She saw that Angels with Dirty Faces was going to be on TV, and she made me sit down in front of the TV and said, you're going to watch this from beginning to end. And when it's over, I want you to tell me the lesson you've learned. And so I did watch the whole thing. And when it was over, my mother turned to me and went, did you learn a lesson from this? And I'm wiping away my eyes going, yeah, James Cagney's great. That was the lesson I learned. Things like that.
Do you see yourself as a tough guy or the opposite?
Oh God, no, not at all. Not the least.
Have you ever been in a fight?
Oh, hell yes. Not since I've been an adult, but when I was a kid, I used to get in fights all the time, constantly. And I very rarely won. But that aside, I don't consider myself a tough guy. I admire real toughness for real good reason. I remember when I was doing promotion for Lee Marvin Point Blank, and there'd be like call-in shows or what have you. And I get people calling in or saying, we really like Lee Marvin. We're Lee Marvin fans too, because he's not a pussy. He's a solid, tough guy, and he could kick Obama's ass. Now, whenever I would hear that said, I would always say the same thing. Let me tell you something. Just because he's a tough guy doesn't make him a Republican or a conservative or what have you. John Wayne maybe, but I can tell you for a fact, Lee Marvin was a Democrat and a liberal. So was Burt Lancaster. So was Robert Mitchum. So was Kirk Douglas. So were a lot of these post-war tough guy action movie stars. Don't always assume, because you would be wrong.
Yeah, and when you take a look at Lee Marvin's life, boy, he had a lot of shit happening to him, and because of him, the famous palimony suit. He was an alcoholic. You argue that he was suffering from post-traumatic, right? Yeah, well, here's the thing about PTSD. I assume that, and I tell everybody I talk to that I'm not a clinician. I'm not a therapist or doctor. I have no idea. I came to that conclusion on my own. And what's interesting was after the book came out, the Lee Marvin bio came out, I spoke again to a very close friend of his. His name was Ralph O'Hara, who was living in Florida. And I asked him, do you think Lee had PTSD? And he went, absolutely he did. And he knew it. And unfortunately, like I said, it was after the book came out I discovered this. Lee Marvin had a friend who was a doctor, a psychiatrist. His name is Dr. Harry Wilner. And Wilner had sent him a bunch of videotapes of soldiers being interviewed, mostly vets from the Vietnam War. And as Lee was, because he wanted him to pick out the best interviews to put together for a documentary. And Ralph O'Hara was watching these with him. And Lee Marvin apparently watched them and his jaw dropped as he was watching them. And he said, son of a bitch, these guys sound just like me. I have PTSD too. So, and believe me, I told everybody, if I'd have known that when I was working on the book, it would definitely have gone in, but I didn't know it. How would you have changed it? How would you have adjusted?
I would have said it specifically. I would not have assumed. But I often said, I think I said in the book, if there were 10 symptoms of PTSD, Lee Marvin probably had 8 of them. Truth of the matter was he had all 10. And I would cite examples from people who were close to him. His brother, whom I interviewed at length, his brother Robert, who was older than by about 18 months, he said many was the night he'd wake up screaming, dreams in the middle of the night, or if a door would slam, he would freak out, or his son told me that, and so did his first wife, that, and he was an alcoholic, and many a veteran, sought to ease their pain in the bottle. And he tried to quit, but he never did. And he was a chain smoker too.
He was also friends with John Wayne. They were close, weren't they?
Well, they weren't close, but they worked together 3 times. And, in terms of philosophies and beliefs, they were very different men. Betty Marvin, Lee Marvin's first wife, told me this adorable story that when they were making Donovan's Reef in Hawaii, she gave John Wayne and Lee Marvin hula lessons. And I would have given my left arm to see that.
Yeah.
Would you love to have seen John Wayne and Lee Marvin doing the hula?
I know.
Yeah. She made this great analogy about their screen personas. She said, on screen, Lee was like a panther. You never knew what he was going to do and how he was going to do it, and at any moment he was going to jump. He would, theatrically speaking, she said he was very much like a glass thrown against the wall just before it breaks. And I love the way she said that. And then she
Excellent.
said, John Wayne, he was like a great, big, lovable bear. He would move slow. He would act slow. He would talk slow. But that was his appeal, and it worked.
Tell me something. When you're getting into the characters, when you're starting, I guess, write vociferously hours a day about a particular person, Lee Marvin, what happens in your head over time? I think you had about 9 months to write the last book, right?
The Killin Generals, yeah.
It was a very short period of time. But what happens in your head as time ticks, as you write more about that person, the more you get to know them? Do they change in your imagination, your thinking? Does your relationship adjust?
Oh, it evolves, if that's what you're asking, yeah. I'll tell you a real quick anecdote again about how I came to write this book, Lee Marvin. It took me 20 years, by the way, to research and write. But I had a friend who is have a friend who's also a biographer, wrote a great book on Steve McQueen. And we got together for lunch or dinner anyway, and we started talking. And he said, with your knowledge of movies, you should write a biography. And I said, well, I'd like to, but you wrote it. I would love to have written about Steve McQueen. And then we started talking about possibilities. And he had been in the financial industry before he became a writer. Excuse me. And he said, you've got to look at it from a financial point of view. Who hasn't had a really good book written about them? And we went through several names and we came up with Lee Marvin. Now, at first I was kind of reticent. I'm a fan, don't get me wrong, but I'm not that big of a fan. And what little I knew about him at the time, I wasn't that thrilled with. Then one day I was at the library looking up stuff about him. And I read this article in Film Comment magazine. It was called, it was a running column written by different filmmakers. And it was called Guilty Pleasures. Mm-hmm. Movies that you know are bad, but you love them anyway. And this one was written by Jim Jarmusch. He's a fairly well-known underground filmmaker, and he listed 10 different films, and one of them was just any Lee Marvin movie. He just loved Lee Marvin. It turns out he also started an organization called the Sons of Lee Marvin, and he explains about that. Now, when he's telling about why he loved Lee Marvin, he also says one of the members of the Sons of Lee Marvin is Tom Waits. You know who he is, right?
Yeah.
Well, he said, one night, this guy comes into the bar Tom Waits is playing at, and he asked the bartender, is Tom Waits here? The bartender said, yeah, he's in the back. And he went, okay, thanks. And so he goes into the back room, and there's Tom Waits, and this guy asked Tom Waits, he goes, are you Tom Waits? And he goes, yeah, why? And then the guy goes, are you in the Sons of Lee Marvin? To which Tom Waits says, well, I'll tell you the truth. It's a secret organization, and I can't tell you anything about it. Yeah. To which this guy then says, well, I think it stinks. And Tom Waits goes, well, what the fuck is it to you? And the guy goes, I'm Lee Marvin's son, and I think it stinks. Now, I'm in the library, and when I read that, I laughed out loud. I was howling. I got asked to leave by the librarian, and that was just one of those things that made me start to like Lee, because I never heard that about anybody. I know there's a Humphrey Bogart cult and a Marilyn Monroe cult, James Dean. I never heard about the Sons of Lee Marvin and that whole kind of thing. By the way, when I met Christopher Marvin, Lee Marvin's son, I asked him if that was true. And he goes, no, it's not true. That never happened. Tom Waits.
And over the years, have people come out of the woodwork to approach you, tell you how much they love Lee or do not love him? Are you sort of the Lee Marvin pundit now?
I don't know. Sure.
Why not, right?
Why not, exactly. It's interesting that when I was doing some of the promotion for the book, one of the first places I went to was a college, a university called SCAD, the South Carolina Art and Design Institute called SCAD, and I did a like a Q&A afterwards. And when I was done, this guy and his wife come up to me, and she says to me, everything you said was fascinating, and we could really identify because my husband has PTSD.
Yeah.
And the guy's standing right there, and he looked at me and smiled when she's right. And he goes, I want to thank you for talking about it because for some reason people don't want to talk about it anymore. Like it's an embarrassment. And he said, I became a cop, and I was a pilot in Vietnam, and I became a helicopter cop because it was the best way I could deal with what I had dealt with during the war. So yeah, I have PTSD, and people telling me stuff like that was really, kind of trippy.
But is it nice though that you bring this out of people?
Yes, it is, because especially if they tell me how anything I may have done or said affects them in a positive way. I'm on social media, and I get a lot of people telling me how much they love Lee Marvin, and thank you for writing this book. And I've always, the first amount of work I did on the research was for an article in Film Facts magazine about Lee Marvin. It was called The Mind Behind the Muscle. And a lot of people wrote into the magazine saying how much they really loved the article, and they found out stuff about Lee Marvin they never knew before, even though they've been Lee Marvin fans and read everything about him. And then when the book came out, what amazed me was, and I should give credit where credit is due, the publisher, a guy named Tim Schaffner of Schaffner Press, he really went out of his way to help promote it. And so consequently, on Amazon, I've got almost 1,000 positive reviews. That's which fantastic. Is cool. That's one of the ways it wound up on the New York Times bestsellers list, is that everybody who read it liked it. And they also like to say that I've read other stuff about Lee Marvin before. This is the best. This guy nails it. This guy knows what he's talking about. And I like that because, when you're a writer, you never know what people are going to think while you're doing the work. You're like, I'm going to put this out there and cross my fingers. But the effect was apparently the research paid off, and that's what I like.
So, who are you? Who are you to Lee Marvin? Are you his archivist? Are you the fellow? I guess.
Well, here's the thing. When I was working on the book, I spent about 2 weeks at the Marvin family home in Woodstock, New York, with Lee Marvin's brother, Robert. And the first night I was there, I slept in Lee Marvin's bed.
Oh.
In his old bedroom. And it was funny because there was one of those kind of East Coast storms. It was the summer where there was a lot of lightning and a lot of thunder, but no rain.
Yeah.
It was like a dry storm. And it was impossible to go to sleep. So I got up and I started wandering around the house. Everybody else, Robert and his wife, had long gone to bed. It was about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I go through the basement and I discover this box, a valise, as they used to call it, of home movies. And I found them. And the next morning, it turns out his father, Lee Marvin's father, for a while worked for Kodak in the late 20s and early 30s, around the time Robert and Lee were little kids. And he took a lot of home movies. And I told it to Robert, and I said, you know what? I think Lee was kind of pissed that I was sleeping in his bed, and he made me get up and get out. And Robert looked at me, and he said, did you ever think maybe Lee wanted you to get up and find those films?
Ah, nice. Very nice.
And I thought, I like the way you think, Robert. That's cool.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly done your research.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, good for you. Dwayne, I enjoyed this conversation so much, and I want to thank you once again for being my guest. I think it's fascinating what you do, and I'm really taken by the fact that you can be so incredibly curious about another human being. Many people that we know, they focus on themselves so much.
That's
but here
3/4 of the battle. You've got to be curious. Absolutely have to.
Yeah, I totally agree. When people ask me what is the trick about being a decent interviewer, I would say right up there in the top 3 things. One is for sure curiosity, right?
Yep.
Of which you clearly have. So I want to thank you for all the marvelous books that you've put out, the information that you've gotten out to the public. I think that people are fascinated by this time in history. I happen to agree with you, and by these characters. And I really think you're a marvelous writer, and I really enjoyed our time together. So thank you for that.
Thank you. By the way, if I can, just real quick, the book Killin Generals is available on Amazon, as well as the publisher's website, Kensington, and so is Lee Marvin Point Blank. It's hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. And Killin Generals is paperback and Kindle. And sales are doing well. And hopefully your listeners will see this and continue, good sales.
Amen. Amen. By the way, that cough that you had, I had it too. It was the toughest thing doing interviews.
Yeah.
Toughest
I
thing.
heard that one interview you did with that one nice lady that I heard you were dealing with the same issue.
The whole time I was coughing. Excuse me, I have a bad cough. Yeah. So I feel for you. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for watching and for listening. As I said at the top of the show, I would ask you please to listen very carefully to my guest today, Dwayne Epstein, and to see the work that he's put into developing his skill. And Dwayne, I think it's appropriate to say that you have found your zone in life. Would that be right?
Absolutely right. Took me a while to get there, but yes, I did find it.
You seem like a happy man.
Thank you. As are you. You found
I am.
as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be back soon. Until then, once again, thank you for joining us, and go in health and have a very, very beautiful day.